So at the beginning of March this year, I went to Paris to the IMAG Art Festival with a very good friend of mine. Her name is Robin Rosendahl. And she made an absolutely fantastic vlog about that whole happening. And it was such an amazing time where we met fantastic artists. We talked to people from every possible industry, from the gaming industry to the movie industry, to publishing, to just and everything in between. I'm still kind of speechless about this because it was such an inspiring weekend, and I've learned so much. For example, working with lights, working with different kinds of compositions, working with a sort of threefold rule that I'll be talking about a little bit more further into this video. But yeah, IMAG was a blast, and it was definitely worth going to. Now, because I learned so much, and because I was so eager to get started with everything that I'd learned, I figured, you know what, why not try something completely different compared to what I usually make? So in today's video, I will be working on a rainforest piece that, although it might have a little bit of a fantasy edge, it's not necessarily fantasy. So stick with me while I work on this particular illustration, and I will talk you through the different processes and techniques that I've used for this one. So if you do like what you see, please be sure to hammer that like button, and if you haven't yet, please subscribe to the channel, because it really does help sharing this whole art journey with everyone and anyone. In any case, thanks so much for joining me, and welcome back to another Butcher Shop. So when I was at IMAG Art Festival in Paris, there were so many things, so many insights that I learned and that I, was very thankful to take home. One of which was the sort of threefold rule for any illustration you want to make, and that rule goes as follows: layout, mood, and story. And so, hearing this, you might probably think, well, duh. And in a way, yes, this is very much an open door. However, I think one of the important things that I realized, listening to this particular lecture, was that sometimes you get so caught up in, the process of your drawing and, time pressure because your clients are waiting. Basically, you're working so hard that you kind of forget about the rules sometimes. And so hearing this particular thing from such a successful artist was kind of an eye-opener. Just so to go back with layout, mood, story. So layout is obviously the composition of your drawing. And so this very particular drawing, I started with this threefold rule in mind. I wanted it to be a composition that led your eye towards this specific place at the very center of the drawing. One of the easier ways to do that is to work with a sort of tunnel. So what I basically did was draw a forest composition that leads your eye to where I want you to look. So even though the forest surrounding this illustration is going to be pretty, and it's going to be, or at least I hope it looks good at the end, all it's supposed to do basically is grab your sight, grab your eyes, and lead it, push it towards that center. So with that in mind, I had to come up with a specific mood that I wanted this to be in. And so considering this was a rainforest piece, rainforests by themselves are actually pretty dark, so I had to go with something that drew in a little bit more light. So there is light at the end of the tunnel. As ironic as that sounds, because yes, I'm working with a tunnel composition, but at the same time I want this rainforest to feel super dense, because that's what rainforests are after all. But I didn't want to lose any of that light, so what I did is basically I cheated my way into, the mood of this thing by creating this big opening in the middle from which the sun comes in. So we have a very, very obvious light source that is literally the light at the end of the tunnel, and again also that light direction sort of funnels you towards where I want you to look. You can already kind of see it happening here, even with just the outlines. Like you see the lines, you see the circle, and where it becomes smaller, where it starts leading you. All right, so we have layout, we have mood. The mood is very much greens and yellows in this illustration. Well, greens, obvious because forest. And the yellows are obviously a sort of translation of sunlight. And now the third part of this rule was the story. So it's all very cool if we had a composition and if we have a specific mood that we want to convey, but what about the story that we're trying to tell? Now, I've showed this sketch to quite a couple of my friends, and I've asked them, like, what's the story here? Because I know I have a particular story in mind when I show you this picture. But I was curious to see if the story that I had in mind was actually the same story that people would see, once they looked at the finished piece. So what I want to try here is to sort of give you that illusion of being in this forest, a very, not a very friendly place, even though it looks kind of magical, and there's so much life in a rainforest, we all know that. But I kind of wanted this to feel dead. I wanted this to be a dead space. So I want the viewer to be in the very darker part of the forest, looking towards the light, where we will also see this sign of life in the form of this lynx who is walking across a dinosaur skull. And I think it's that dinosaur skull that immediately sort of draws you into, in some form or way, a fantasy world after all. Because dinosaurs aren't real anymore. I mean, they're real, but they're all kind of dead, like this happened a couple of million years ago. I wasn't there to tell you. But yes. So we have this combination of darkness, of light, of death, and of life, and maybe even of history and of future. So there is a couple of layers to the story that I'm trying to tell here, and it's all sort of being told through color and through light, which creates that mood, and it makes sure that you follow the story because of that composition. So this threefold rule was such an amazing thing to learn and to be reminded of during the IMAG festival, that this was, it had to be something that I would put into my next illustration and to be so aware of while I was working on it. So let me know in the comments if you think, this worked out or not. Let me know what you think is the story behind this. Even though you just heard me tell you what my idea was, I would love to know your thoughts if you look at this thing and, feel or see a completely different kind of story. Because, at the end of the day, art is art. So if you interpret this in a different way, that is actually kind of cool. So let me know what you think. Let me know what you see. So another thing that may have caught your eye by now is that I am working with different kinds of brushes. I have been an artist known for, for many years. For many years, I've been known to use just one single brush. Like every now and then I would pull up like a stamp brush or, a little bit of texture, but I would do everything by hand. I would normally paint in each leaf manually. If there's fur in a drawing, which I will talk a little bit more about, later on in this video, but fur is something that I have always done and probably will always do by hand. But if you look at the structure of these trees, you're already seeing me work with a lot of different brushes. And this was just an experiment with texture, really. We can create a mood all we want, and we can have our composition, cool, and we can come up with such vivid colors and everything. But if the texture falls flat, it's not really, it's kind of pointless. So I was really trying to make an effort to kick in more textures than what I normally would do. And it resulted in some very interesting stuff actually, because I don't think I've ever managed to create a forest that looks so alive, really. There is moss growing, there is the bark of the trees that has, pretty sensitive details in there, pretty, it's rough, it's actually bark. This is not a piece of plastic, this is not, you know, this fumato kind of style that I usually work in. This is raw bark, this is wood, and this is hundreds of years old. And I was actually kind of proud. I don't know if I'm allowed to say that. I was kind of proud to see, those textures come together. And even if you look at the color work, like there's maybe 4 or 5 different colors of brown in here, but because they are blending and because the transparency of the brush that I'm also using, everything comes together so well. Like the moss on these trees looks so fluffy. This is the kind of spongy moss that you want to sort of sleep on, that you want to, just create a bed with and just sleep in the forest. It's incredibly soft against this super raw bark of the tree. So again, like these contrasts between what I'm trying to illustrate, and what I'm trying, the story that I'm trying to tell, like even on a micro level, even if you look at the textures, there are stories to tell. And it was really kind of cool that, because I had learned this threefold rule, that all of a sudden I could see that come back into pretty much everything that I was doing. Like as long as you are aware of what you're doing, this kind of stuff happens. And I think that is one of the bigger takeaways of this IMAG weekend in Paris, is that being aware of what you're doing and being aware of what you want to do kind of gets you halfway there already. Because, I think most artists, like most people who work in whatever form of art industry, even if it's for themselves or, in a professional level, it doesn't matter. We are so tempted to sort of lose ourselves in our details, in the time that we're working on something, and what brushes are we using here, and is the color work good? Like we get lost in all these questions that we ask ourselves while working, and I think learning about this rule sort of pushes me out of that particular behavior, and instead of asking questions, I am telling myself what to do. I'm not asking, should I be doing this? I am telling myself, you should be doing this. And it makes the whole illustration work such a more conscious process. Even though you're still led by, does this feel right? Because I think I will always be a person who will decide which color I need based on feeling. Of course I will kick in some color theory every now and then, but most of the time it is just, does this feel good? But yeah, again, instead of asking myself, does this feel good? I told myself, this should feel good, so be sure to pick the colors that make that happen. So you really come into sort of a position of control. You come into sort of this godlike position where you can create and where you can, destroy and rebuild, and reshape and recolor as you go. But because it is such a conscious process, you never really kind of feel like you are behind on the process. Like you don't feel like you are walking behind yourself, watching it all happen and then correcting mistakes. You sort of get ahead of the process, which is an incredible feeling. It's really, yeah. I think this is one of the biggest lessons that I'd learned during the weekend. And it's actually kind of cool to see it all come together. Like, I love this tree. Like, this tree on the left of this illustration, like the one that we're looking at now, I love how many textures are on there. I love the way the light comes off and reflects on the little bits of moss. I want to hug that tree. Yeah, there's nothing wrong with that. And that was actually kind of funny. It was a bit of an insider joke. One of the artists who held a lecture during IMAG, he's very famous for drawing his trees, and his trees are almost like characters in themselves. And he prefaced his lecture by saying something along the lines of, I do not hug trees, they are not my friends, they are not living beings, or, and people who hug trees are weird. And I was like, well, thank you. I mean, come on, we've all hugged a tree once or twice in our life, haven't we? There's nothing wrong with that. So yeah, just saying out loud, like, this tree is so fluffy, I want to hug it, kind of takes me back to that moment, thinking, it's not strange. I'm not strange. I just want to hug that tree. All these plants and leaves, like, I could have used a brush. I could have used a stamp brush, sure. And you know what? Later on, for the foreground, I actually do. Not because, it's a time saver, but I also kind of wanted to give this sort of depth of field with it. So I want the middle of this illustration to be super detailed, because I want these details to sort of fix your eyes on the center of this illustration. So in the foreground, I use more stamp brushes and, plant brushes and all that kind of stuff, to sort of take away the shape from it. And we'll look at that later, and I will talk a little bit more about that then. But because there are so many details all in the very center of this illustration, again, it sort of pulls you towards the point of gravity. So yeah, I could have done all these leaves and all these plants with a brush, and it would have saved me a lot of time, but because I did this all by hand, I actually managed to kick in a lot more details, and I can play around with the light and how it reflects off the leaves and everything, exactly in the way that I wanted to. Yeah, this dinosaur skull is where the story comes in, isn't it? This is where it is no longer your normal rainforest. This is where it becomes, I don't know, maybe it is a picture from the past, like way past. Maybe this is something, in way, way ahead in the future. This is where the story actually begins. Like, we have a rainforest, we have a lot of trees, we have a lot of leaves and foliage, and that's all very cool, and it looks fluffy, and we all want to hug that tree, that's cool. But because this skull is suddenly there, and it's huge, it's a big skull, big enough to carry a lynx or a bobcat. Because that skull is there, all of a sudden this story starts to tell itself. And it's, I don't know, it's always kind of extraordinary to have this idea in your head and then do this one little thing in your illustration, and all of a sudden everything comes together. Like, this is your connective tissue between all the different trees. They're all connected through this one thing that lies in the middle of it, half buried in water and dust and sand and plants, and it's half overgrown also with moss and vines. This is like connective tissue, yeah. And to get that light on there was actually kind of difficult, because I don't really have a dinosaur skull in my backyard that I could use as a reference. So I looked at the Parasaurolophus skull that I could find on the internet, so I used a reference for that. But where on earth is the light going to be? Like, obviously we have the sun shining in the middle, but how is it going to refract off the bone structure? Like, how far is that reflection going to carry itself? That was quite an interesting thing to sort of experiment with, because again, like, I can't really pull up anything that has the same texture and the same structure of an actually fossilized skull. So this was pretty interesting to just, sink my teeth in and just go with the flow. And again, like, trying not to ask myself, is this good? But more telling myself, this should be good. Or, not asking myself, where does the light go? But just to make that conscious decision of, the light goes there. It's such a different way of working, and I kind of like it. Even though a lot of artists might say, well, again, duh, this is what art should be. Well, and maybe it is. I don't know, I just realized that I'm not always that conscious, or I'm not always making these conscious decisions while I'm working. So yeah, for me this was just a fun experiment. I was almost going to say a little experiment, but obviously this was not a little experiment. Because yeah, this piece took me over a week to get done. Like I spent, well, nearly 10 days to get all these little thingies and mosses and all these tiny little details together. So I'm kind of leaving it up to your imagination. If this skull is half sunken in sand or if it's water. Like, I didn't really mind it not being too obvious, although there is a bit of a reflection. So in my mind, it's water, but so much of the reflection gets lost in, the foliage and in the foreground later on, that it could just as well be mud or sand or like some sort of forest floor. And that's cool. Like maybe this is just a little pond, or at least that's what it is in my mind. But it was interesting to sort of work on something and consciously leaving it as something that, could still be interpreted as something else. Yeah, so here you actually see me pick up stamp brushes to sort of get that more ambiguous sort of shape at the front. Again, to create that contrast between what is happening in the front and where I want your eyes to actually go. So because I leave these shapes a little bit more vague and a little less detailed and a little less alive maybe even, because of that, I'm trying to force you to look to where, the magic of this illustration happens. Is this cheating? Maybe it is. Does it feel like cheating? It kind of does. I mean, I could have just used a foreground filter, like I could have used a blur or a lens blur or something like that to sort of take off the edge as well. But no, I chose to go with, a very dense and heavy texture, because again, this was the part where you were in the rainforest. You as the viewer are in this dark area, this dark, dense area, ready to swallow you up. So yeah, the very dense stamps were, again, a conscious decision. Oh, and here's the funny thing. So I started with the lynx, and what else is a lynx if not 100% piece of fur? Okay, make it 99.9% because he's got eyes and a nose. Now, some of you who've been on my channel for a while know how much how much I absolutely hate drawing fur. I just don't like it. And again, this all comes down to brushes, because I have tried so many different types of fur brushes and I've never managed to find a fur brush that actually gives me the effect that I wanted to have. Now, if you think that you have the most perfect fur brush in the world, please let me know. Like, comment down below, or like, I don't know, send me a message on Facebook or Insta or whatever. Just find me somewhere and show me the brush, because I would love to. Because I absolutely hate doing fur by hand. But, up until this point, it is actually the only way in which I can actually get fur done. So it's always this sort of funny and ironic sort of love-hate relationship between me and drawing, because I hate doing it, but then when I take a step back and I look at the work, it does look kind of cool. Like, there's this very photorealistic effect to the lynx right now, simply because I'm using like 3 pixel large or tall brushes. It's incredible. It's just hundreds of thousands of pen stripes with a 3 pixel brush, but it gets the job done. So yeah, I mean, at the end of the ride, I am always very happy with what I created and how it looks. But man, this is a process of suffering, and I do mean suffering. Yeah, lots of rim lighting because I wanted. Okay, so here's another thing. I've drawn a lot of fur in my life, even though I hate it. Like for example, the whole Age of Mice series, where I draw tiny mice in their own little story of a part of our human history. So I had a Napoleon mouse, I had a knight, I had a monk, or etc. But all these mice sort of they work with light. Like I've done a lot of God rays and I've done a lot of fur refraction as well. But I wanted the light catching off on the fur to be just a little bit more special in this one. So what I did with this lynx was like you can see right here. I used like absolute white just on the edges, so to draw out those individual hairs that catch the light is what in the end is going to make him look so incredibly fluffy. And light has always been a thing that I've been absolutely fascinated with. There was a time, especially when I was working on my Singularian drawing still, where I worked from the dark towards the light. And I realized that over the last couple of years, because Singularian started in 2020 and went on all the way up until 2023. So if I make my first illustration for the Singularian in 2020, that's been 5 years. So in these last 5 years, I realized that I've worked, or I've sort of gone from, from darkness towards the light, more into a part where, more into a place where I've sort of embraced the light and actually let it work for me. So I no longer use the light to sort of pull out the details at the end, and that's because that's what I did with the Singularian drawings. But instead, I now use the light kind of from the beginning on. It is very much a part of the illustration. If this would have been a Singularian drawing, I would not have picked up the white until the lynx was all the way done. And as you can see here, I'm using the white, like the pearl white, to create these very tiny little hair drawings in the middle of the fur as well. And I think, at least because I'm doing that here, is because of that the fur sort of comes to life, and it makes it a whole. It no longer makes this rim lighting a separate thing. It becomes part of the object, which again, for a lot of artists, this may sound super obvious, but again, like, if you've been doing something in a particular way for so many years, it is kind of refreshing to have, these sort of happy accidents, or to have these, new people telling you these old ways. It's kind of fantastic, really. I remember at this point in the drawing, I was so done. I knew I was only halfway. Like, I still had the whole lower body of this thing to go. But man, was I done. But sometimes you just gotta do what you gotta do. You just grind your teeth for a little longer and just put in those extra 100,000 pen stripes. This is pure stubbornness that gets me through, really. It's not even determination, it's just stubbornness. And I think for the whole time that I've been working on this fur, I intended to just leave it as it is, as you can see it here. So with the full-on brush texture there was something raw in it, there was something very vivid in there. Like it was, the fur is such a good, strong contrast compared to everything around this lynx. So compared to the trees and compared to the leaves and compared to the moss, it was such a good contrast. But then when I finished, doing the whole fur in this particular texture, I had this weird sort of urge to pick up my blender brush, which again is a tool that a lot of people might know me for, because I blend everything. Like, life is just a giant blender. You just pick it up and start blending. And I did, and you will see that in a bit, but you know what? It was actually a good call, because I think looking at it now, the fur of the lynx was too rough. It was too raw. The contrast was good, but it was, I don't know, it was a little bit jarring to the eye to have everything so smooth and so whimsy in a way. And the lynx just felt off. It felt like it came from a different world. And I didn't want that. Like, if anything, I wanted this lynx to be part of this world. Very much so. Like, I wanted the stranger to be the person looking at this illustration. I wanted you to be in this darker part of the forest, feeling left out, and almost kind of yearning for whatever was happening out there in the sunshine. Like, I wanted you to feel like you had to go there. You wanted to go over to this animal and appreciate the fact that it was alive and that it was there, even though it may not have seen you, or maybe it did see you, but it just ignored you. Like, again, these are all sort of the storytelling components that, I kind of put together here. And then here we go, picking up the brush, picking up the blender brush. And I'm staying away from the face as much as I can, because I did want the face to be super sharp. But yeah, look, it's so fluffy. I think it was a very good call to blend the fur, at least like 50%, because it's not even on 100%. But it's just taking out those rough edges. It's just taking out the harsh details that didn't feel right, that felt a little bit out of place. So that was it. That was my first experiment after IMAG Art Festival. I hope you enjoyed watching this. I hope you enjoyed some of these insights, of how I work. And let me know what you think in the comments down below. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.